Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of SHMA Talks. I'm Clive Read, partner and head of the Birmingham office of Shakespeare Martineau, and today I'm delighted to be joined by one of the most influential leaders in the region, Neil Rami. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Clive. I'm not so sure about the most influential, but anyway, looking forward to it.
Yeah, excellent. As everybody will know, Neil is Chief Executive of the West Midlands Growth Company, which is the region's official investment promotion agency charged with attracting inward investment, jobs and visitors to the West Midlands. So as everybody will know from seeing around the town, Birmingham and the West Midlands has undergone a renaissance for many years now. And there's a real sense of dynamism and excitement about the place, which is really sort of palpable. We've got lots of physical developments going on, which as a property lawyer is of huge interest to me, but there's plenty more going on. So we've got the Commonwealth Games coming up, and there are many other opportunities and major projects in the city, whether it's around Digbeth, Brindley Place, and everywhere else that's helping play a part in shaping the future for Birmingham and also the wider region. But we're just coming out of the back of the pandemic. So, Neil, the first question, I guess, is really, how has Birmingham and then the wider West Midlands economy been impacted by COVID-19, and how is the local economy recovering?
Yeah, look, we haven't been immune to this pandemic by any stretch. In fact, I think it's fair to say that the West Midlands was probably one of the regions hit hardest by the pandemic, and there are various reasons for that. We're a young demographic, we're a young region, and clearly all statistics would suggest that this has had a bigger impact potentially on the young, and I think one of the legacies of that is a higher youth unemployment than we had going into this. We're also now a region very heavily dependent on the visitor economy. And of course, it's worth something like 13 billion to the West Midlands. And of course, it was one of the first sectors in and inevitably one of the last sectors out. But we're also a global international region with roots to all parts of the world. So the effect of supply chains have clearly had an impact. I think we were something like 11.8, 12% down in 2020. The good news is we are arguably coming out faster than any other English region. So the last statistic I looked at for projection for 2021 is a 10% growth this year, which is phenomenal. And I think there's some good reasons for that. We've continued to attract investment. You've talked about real estate, and ironically, having not many people around Birmingham city centre has helped many of our construction sites get on with the job. But I think I'm right in saying that in the last 12 months, we've had a record year on foreign direct investment, despite the pandemic, which, it's been slightly down on jobs, but in terms of projects. And therefore, for the last 5 years, the region has been the best performing region for inward investment. And of course, some high profile names, Goldman Sachs, the Indian company TVS, which acquired Norton, moving into Solihull. And we've also done very well, not really related to the pandemic, but we've done very, very well in terms of public sector growth and relocation around some of these big Whitehall departments, DCLG or whatever it's called this week. DFT and B is all building pretty sizable footprints right across the region. But there's still many issues that we're all trying to face, not least of which the fact that the our city centres, Birmingham, Coventry and Wolverhampton, are nowhere near up and running. We're seeing a good return to public transport, but probably not enough on rail, which would suggest it's the professionals that are longer to return to the city centres. That's not really unique to Birmingham, Coventry or Wolverhampton. That's a national issue. But I think generally we're doing pretty well, actually.
And And you've mentioned the benefits of the strength of inward investment into the city. What are you being told are the reasons why do people come to Birmingham and the West Midlands? What's attractive to them?
So I would argue that many of the fundamentals we went into the pandemic with are still very strong fundamentals for us today. But there's probably one or two other things that have ironically strengthened our position. I mean, look, the first and most important point to make is the 20 years investment in infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure, has begun to really pay great dividends. When you look around, particularly Birmingham city centre, I remember trying to meet investors in what was the old New Street. It was a pretty tough gig. HS2, despite all the controversy and clearly the conversation even today around the eastern leg, we know we're going to have two stations. We know we're going to be better connected to London. Probably more importantly, we know it's going to build capacity for us across the rest of the network. Digital infrastructure, we're the first pilot for government on 5G. In fact, I was in Wolverhampton last week. Their broadband fibre rollout is the highest penetration of anywhere in the country. So wow. As a region, we're really picking up on digital infrastructure. And we're beginning to see changes in how people want to operate. So the migration out of London, particularly of young professionals, which was happening before the pandemic, but has clearly accelerated. I think we have 40% more young professionals out of London coming to Birmingham than any other region. The wage arbitrage and the costs issues have become more of an issue. We saw that when the Brexit kind of impacts were being borne to bear in terms of particularly financial companies in the City of London looking at their own footprint. We've got 60% of the office costs, 50% of the residential costs. And I guess, fundamentally, I think what the pandemic has done is it's making people think very long and hard about what is the life I want to live and where do I want to live. And I think the successful cities and regions, and by the way, I don't believe cities are dead. I think they're even more important now. But I think the most successful regions will be those places that become a destination of choice, where people can see the benefits to bring up a family, where they can build a career, not just get a job, and fundamentally have a better life.
And I guess also, I mean, as a property lawyer, you see actually the value of the real estate. I mean, you touched on that, and that's, I guess, been one of the attractions for major businesses like HSBC, taking what it was, I guess, a very bold step to come into the city at that time, and then that's attracted others, and as you mentioned, Goldman Sachs and others. Do you see, what do you think are the sort of more immediate challenges or areas for improvement? So, I mean, it's good to hear that everything's that things are bouncing back, and we'll come on to the Commonwealth Games towards the end. But do you see other sort of particular challenges that the region needs to address, and that we as businesses need to sort of be playing our part?
So look, I mean, I think the biggest challenge that this city and this region is facing is a similar challenge to other parts of the UK, which is around sustainable development, basically. If COVID and the pandemic has done anything, it's made us more conscious of the world in which we live and how we live our lives. And if you look at some of the challenges facing Birmingham City Council around that, they've been, this is a car city traditionally, so having to bring in the clean air zone, which has clearly been controversial, probably even more controversial, the LTNs, the neighbourhood transport management schemes. But all of this is part of a bigger picture of how do we ensure that we create an environment for the next generation better than the one that we face. I mentioned youth unemployment. I think it's going to be an issue here. There's no doubt that we're seeing some cost of living challenges, which aren't really peculiar to this part of the world, but may affect parts of our conurbation in a way that we haven't seen before. And I guess the bottom line is we spent £407 billion as taxpayers, and therefore I don't think we can assume that the public sector is going to deal with all of those issues. And I think there's a responsibility for the whole of civic society and for business particularly. But I also think that has created huge opportunities for investment. Ironically, in your sector, Chris, we need more spec development. If you look at schemes like Paradise, they've done particularly well. We've got similar schemes like I9 in Wolverhampton, Friargate in Coventry. You build good quality, particularly if they're sustainable buildings. I'm very confident that they're not just investable, but there's demand for them. One of the interesting things we've seen is, before we went into the pandemic, we had this thing called a local industrial strategy. It's sort of slightly out of vogue now with the politicians, but they just call it something else. And what we were trying to track was, what does the future look like, and where can we compete? And there was really 4 areas that we were focused on: smart mobility, the electrification of transport, basically. Clearly huge strengths here with Jaguar Land Rover and rail and aerospace and so on. Data-driven healthcare, which frankly nobody really understood, but of course we're not experts on. Modern business services, which is kind of law tech, prop tech, fintech. The Goldman Sachs investment is interesting because I'm not sure everybody really understands this. It's a digital engineering play. It's basically a digital hub that they're investing here. And then the creative sector, creative technologies. We've got a massive gaming sector in parts of Warwickshire. We're building new media studios in Birmingham. How do you use AR and VR? Of course, all of that accelerated through COVID. People were actually making films remotely or virtually. So what was interesting to us is probably something like 60% of our investment pipeline was in that area pre-COVID. 90% of the investment interest that we're now dealing with are in those 4 key market priorities. So I think what COVID has actually done is it's accelerated the change we knew that was coming. And to answer your question directly, I actually think we were pretty well equipped to think about what that change was. The challenge we have now is, can we move at the pace that everybody else wants us to move at? And that is a challenge.
Yeah. But actually quite a nice challenge to have. It's nice to have those options. It's nice to have that sort of choice. And I guess the building on the city's own diversity. It's those sort of diverse sort of business streams, isn't it, for the future, which should make us more resilient. You talked a bit about benefits for contractors having not many visitors around the place. We know that companies like ourselves and everyone else are starting to make a return to offices. Colleges and universities are now sort of starting back on their new academic years. What does the future of work look like in the West Midlands, do you think? Because it's very different. I mean, the fact that we're doing this all online. In the good old days, you and I would have been sitting sort of opposite each other, in chairs. So how do you see that sort of playing out?
So look, I again, Clive, sorry, I think I called you Chris. It's still work in progress. I think people are still working their way through this. There's no doubt that hybrid working, which was around for many global companies, is now custom and practice. And I think that brings with it some real challenges, actually, particularly for smaller companies, both technology challenges, the investment needed, but also cultural challenges for us all. I mean, I'm personally of the school of thought that there are diminishing returns of the virtual world. I think we've seen huge productivity gains, particularly in professional services, because spending less money on travel and hotel and so on. But I think particularly for our for onboarding, for coaching, for mentoring, even for performance management, the leaders, the sort of business leaders I talk to, are really quite concerned, and they would say that some of their young people are saying, look, we're not working from home, we're living in the office, and that's not really where we want to be. So I think there will have to be some leadership in this area. I think many of the sort of business leaders, and particularly those in professional services in Birmingham and our cities, are on the case and actually very proactive. But I think there are also issues for the environments in which we live. I mean, again, if you look at Birmingham 10, maybe 15 years ago, we didn't have independent sectors. You know, we didn't have the cafes, the restaurants, even the culture. Much of that is contingent or dependent on us spending our pounds in those places. So there's a wider kind of civic responsibility that I think we need to be mindful of. I mean, I think that said, there are some great advantages to the ability to live in Coventry and, you know, and work in Chile, as it were. And we are seeing, and it goes back to what I think I said earlier on, which was, I think the successful places will be those places that people actually want to live in, because fundamentally, you know, we need an environment where people kind of where people want to be. I think what we're seeing technically are some interesting developments. So we're seeing more onshoring. So, you know, tightening supply chains means that certainly in the manufacturing sector, we are definitely seeing companies, and this was maybe a slight Brexit issue, but it's become very, very apparent of companies saying, look, we think we need to be here. This phrase right shoring, which is kind of what's the right kind of footprint for us, and where should we be? And of course, as I mentioned earlier on, the notion of north shoring, which is really out of London activity. So people are looking at their footprint. And I was talking to Ian Stewart, who runs HSBC recently, and he said, Neil, you need to remember that building that we built was for 2,000 people. In a hybrid world, it can actually accommodate 4,000 people. So actually, we need to remind ourselves, this isn't potentially not about less people coming into our cities. It's over time, potentially more people. And that in itself will bring some challenges to us, you know, from a sort of, you know, from a planning perspective, I guess.
And I guess that makes us, you know, that potentially that feeds into the environmental picture as well, in terms of trying to make us more efficient and adapt to the new ways and the travel and the environment around that as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no doubt we had the sort of 10-point plan from government about a year ago. You know, I think everybody would applaud that, but we do need to see the action against that. So. Yeah. Whether it's charging points, you know, whether it's commercial vehicles and how are they going to be charged, you know, there's a lot of detail in this that needs some planning. What I would say is, if you know, the mantra from government at the moment is about, you know, improving productivity. Well, the places that productivity, you know, if you look at the history of this country, innovation and productivity come from when people come together, you know, and that will be our cities and our universities and our businesses coming together. So I do think, and also, you know, there was a sort of assumption that it's more sustainable to work from home. I think that's also being proven, that actually when you have to heat your home, you know, and there are great efficiencies of actually bringing people together. So, you know, I'm quite hopeful. I'm not saying that we will return to where we were before, but I think the benefits of hybrid working are there, but we also need to recognize that people will need to work together, because that's kind of how the world works.
Absolutely. And we've talked a little bit about some of the sort of challenges for the sort of city and the region. As the sort of bounce back gets underway, where do you see the greatest potential for the region to attract investment?
So it's probably broadly in the areas that I've described. If you take, I mean, I think sustainable development, we've got a really strong opportunity here, whether it's, you know, rail engineering, hydrogen trains, very light rail being pioneered in Warwick University. Some of the best brains in the world are doing it here, and we're now applying it here. In terms of construction, 40% of all our carbon footprint comes from that sector. So there is a huge requirement, I think, beholden on us to look at modern methods of manufacturing, of construction. I do think this is probably an area where Treasury and government will need to incentivize, the gap between doing things conventionally and modularly, and possibly even incentivize through capital allowances, the manufacture of that. We've made some progress, or the combined authority has made some progress in potentially finding some resource to do that. But we've got the National Brownfield Institute in Wolverhampton. We've got the Zero Carbon Homes Task Force. I think the CA recently produced its sort of circular economy route map. So these are all areas where I actually think we've got a competitive edge and a competitive advantage. In the healthcare area, we saw at the height of the pandemic, L&G and Bruntwood SciTech making a huge investment into the Innovation Health Campus at Birmingham, £210 million. There's no doubt, if you look at our demographics and our clinical expertise, that's an area that's growing fast. Interesting statistic I picked up today: low carbon manufacture increased by 7% in the West Midlands in the last 18 months, despite the fact that the West Midlands economy went down by 9%. So that gives you a signal really to where we are. I think it will. Some people will say it was the North. I would say it was this part of the world that was the home of the Industrial Revolution. I think we should be sort of pushing now to be the home of the green Industrial Revolution. I think we're pretty well equipped to compete in that.
And we also have some fantastic universities and colleges in the region that are sort of upskilling all our young people, but then also revisiting with sort of adult education as well. So, and I know we've got a couple of colleges on board today. So I think I see that as another key strength of the region.
People ask me, what is it you do? I mean, fundamentally on the investment side, 70% of what we deal with is around talent. It's around identifying talent, and it's about facilitating those kind of conversations. I mean, we've got huge strengths both in HE and in FE here, both vocationally and in terms of our sort of our R&D driven institutions. I mean, what I would say is Goldman Sachs, we were obviously involved in that conversation for quite a long period of time before, they were able to make a decision. They couldn't believe that we had 57,000 graduates in 8 universities on our doorstep, and something like, what is it? Can't remember the exact figure now, 120,000 graduates within an hour's drive of this. So I'm particularly keen to sort of stress that it doesn't really, I'm sure you won't take this the wrong way, Clive, as a property lawyer, but it doesn't really matter how good our buildings are. It's the people, it's the software, not the hardware, that will drive the program. And what I would say actually is the demands of investors are changing. I saw, I think it was University of Birmingham actually did a survey of employers recently and asked them, what are the top 3 skills that you're looking for? And they might surprise you. The first was resilience. So actually, how do we equip our young people today, at a time when there are lots of pressures on them? The second, as you might expect, was the ability to manage data. So it doesn't really matter what sector you're in, if you can't do that effectively, efficiently. So let's tell all our kids maths is still very important. And the third thing was emotional intelligence. And certainly as a small organization that's taken on quite a few people because of the Commonwealth Games program we're running over the last few months, I would echo that. I think these are all really important attributes that we need to nurture.
That's probably quite a good moment just to, before we move on to the Commonwealth Games. Had a really good question from Louise, saying it's good to hear you mentioning leadership and accentuating the positives and the opportunities for the region ahead. Is there a danger, though, that with so many of us and leaders not in the city centres, that we've lost a bit of civic leadership as people have had to concentrate on adapting their own organisations?
I think that's a great question, Louise, and I think the honest answer is yes. But I do think the leadership of this city and certainly the other cities, and in fact the region, both political and business, are aware of that. And I heard a great phrase the other day, which I pinched actually off Deborah Cadman from Birmingham City Council. We're all in the business of recovery and repurposing, but it needs to be intentional repurposing. We need to think about what it is that we're trying to achieve rather than responding to events. And I think, what I've said earlier on, some of the challenges for this city and this region are, they were there before the pandemic. We've known what we've needed to do. And I do think, we've got some real health challenges, some youth unemployment challenges, the poor have got poorer. There's no doubt about that. And I think some of the work that Louise and others have done in this space, we actually all do need to return to, because unfortunately, some of those challenges are going to be greater. It's why, as I said earlier, I think there's a diminishing returns for of the virtual world. I'm a great advocate to bring people together physically, and I think that and actually seeing is believing. We have to actually see. We were able to tackle some of the real challenges around homelessness. It hasn't particularly gone away, although I think there's been a lot of improvements. But what we now see are kind of professional begging, and that's an issue born around mental health issues, drugs and alcohol abuse. These are all issues that affect us all, and I think it's only by dealing with them in a sort of civic sense that we will make the progress that I think we all would hope for.
Absolutely. Thank you, Louise. That's an excellent question. Well, it would be remiss of me if we didn't mention probably the biggest thing that's going to be happening in Birmingham in the next 12 months, which is the Commonwealth Games, which I think for us is probably a once in a generation opportunity to help showcase the West Midlands to the wider world. How's the West Midlands Growth Company harnessing the long-term economic potential and that the international spotlight will bring, and for more overseas investment and tourism?
Well, it's become ironically, it's become even more important. It was pretty important 2 years ago or 3 years ago actually, when we secured the event, but for obvious reasons, it's become even more important. I think the first thing to say is, when we bid for the games, we knew it wouldn't be the regeneration games in the same way as perhaps London was, or even Manchester in 2002. And ironically, part of our confidence in bidding for the games was that we had 95% of the infrastructure already here. People don't believe me, but it's true. We've hosted more European and World Sporting Championships here than any other city in the UK, including London. So we actually know what we're doing in that space. But there were three reasons, I guess, that the City Council and the region generally were committed to this. The first and the most obvious was, despite all of our successes and the growth of the city over recent years, it's not well known, even in our own country, let alone across the world. So that reputation challenge we have to accept is still there. Perceptions are still somewhat outdated. So this is a huge opportunity to build that platform. I think the second thing was what we saw was, the UK leaving the European Union meant that we needed to develop new relationships globally, and the opportunity to realize some of the potential of some of those Commonwealth countries, both from an export and potentially in the long term, maybe an investment perspective. And actually that's become even more important given some of the geopolitical issues that we're facing now with China and so on. So, Malaysia, Singapore, India, Canada, Australia, these are all important markets. And obviously with the FTAs that UK government's now developing, even more important. But I think the third thing is even more important now because of the pandemic, the ability to connect communities and to ensure that people in this city, in this region, feel that they are vested in the future of the place has become even more important for many of the reasons that I've said before. And I think genuinely the games will bring people together. Just a few statistics for you and your colleagues, Clive. This will be the first fully audienced, if there is such a verb, sporting event in 3 years for obvious reasons. And ticket sales would suggest we're going to see full venues. So somewhere between 1.5 and 1.75 million
Wow.
tickets will be sold. 13,500 volunteers. And last time I looked, 38,000 applicants to be volunteers. So this is a huge community event of a scale that I don't think we will ever see it for some time. 6,500 athletes and officials. And then between 1.5 billion people globally will watch this event. And by the way, it won't just be watched in the Commonwealth. Much of the investment into Commonwealth nations has come from China and the US. So I think this will inevitably be a global event. But your question was quite rightly focused on business and what are you going to do to actually drive investment. So we quite cheekily asked the government, having committed 750 million underwriting of an event, could we have another 20 million more to make the most of our global Britain aspirations? So we've created something called the Business and Tourism Programme, working very much in tandem with DIT, Department of Investment and Tourism, Trade, Visit Britain, supported by the Combined Authority and our sponsor department, I guess, for the Games, DCMS. So this is a triumvirate, really, of a program of some scale, and it's got some set piece moments. So on Thursday of this week, as you probably know, the Queen's baton will leave Buckingham Palace and will start its travels around the world. We will work with colleagues in some of the markets I've mentioned before on doing some set piece events and engagement, both for our own companies here and for investors there. There'll be something called UK House, which is a 11-day conference of high-level business leaders and indeed government leaders coming together, looking at some of the sectors that matter, not just to this region, but to the world, and frankly being a showcase for us to talk about everything that we've got to offer. Visit Britain will run the largest international marketing campaign from a leisure perspective that this region has ever enjoyed. And we're also now working very closely with colleagues locally on something called the West Midlands Jobs and Skills Academy, which is an opportunity to bring some of the sponsors of the Games into those programs, a community fund across the 69 wards across Birmingham. So, we're very, very focused on legacy, both economic legacy and actually, given the sporting credentials, dare I say it, we're now looking at the Ryder Cup and a number of other sporting events. These may not be events that we're around for, that they could be in the next 10 to 20 years. But frankly, you will only get one chance to do this properly and to set, the precedent and the legacy for the next generation. So we're throwing everything at it, really.
And the benefits to the wider region will clearly sort of flow through. How can local businesses sort of support and get involved?
So, our focus, as you might expect, and we are probably a little bit behind on this because of COVID, has been engaging some of those larger companies that are effectively investing in the Games, and that has taken up quite a lot of our time. But we are now moving into the phase where we can broaden that. Many of the things that I've described, companies can get involved in. We're also developing, I can't remember what we call it now, but effectively a Games readiness program where we're going to support 6,000 effectively concierges across the cities, from volunteers within businesses to those on receptions, to taxi drivers and so on. So, frankly, there's a whole range of ways for businesses to engage with the Games. Many companies have already started on that journey. Anybody on the call that wants to get directly involved, please do contact us, and there's a range of events. Clearly, obviously, much of the procurement is now already underway. So there's been a very strong focus by the OC, the organising committee, to try and use local talent and businesses. But there's still opportunities moving forward. And I think the other thing I would say, this is a really important point to make, we've got to be careful that we don't all get focused on the circus, because the circus will leave town. The reality is our program will run for another, I think it's 15 months beyond the Games. And it's some of those events that we will focus on, companies exporting, some of those new markets that I've mentioned around the Commonwealth, and keeping the profile of the city and the region up over the period beyond the games. We've seen, thankfully, probably not in the UK. I think Manchester, Glasgow, and indeed, of course, the London Olympics were all successful events and created the legacy. But we have seen other sporting events in other parts of the world that have left a bit of a sour taste actually in people's mouths afterwards, and haven't perhaps lived up to the promises of their legacy, beyond the 11 days of sport.
And just as we sort of try and sort of wrap up, how would you sort of measure sort of success in terms of that sort of legacy piece? I mean, there'll be an element of infrastructure changes. You can see that if you drive anywhere near Perry Bar these days. But what would you be sort of taking away as a sort of one or two or three things that would be, that you'd say, yeah, we did pretty well from that?
So look, there's lots of hard KPIs that we're all kind of focused on in terms of jobs and GDP growth and everything else. But for me, there's probably three takeaways. The first and the most obvious is, has this done the job in promoting the city and the region beyond our shores and our parish? And there's lots of ways of judging that. The second is, what was the experience like for those people that visited us? And there's still some challenges. This is a sometimes it feels like you're building the plane while the plane's still flying. This is a city that lives and breathes and doesn't stop. But what was the experience like, and will people advocate for us moving forward? And then the final thing is really around that legacy, both in terms of some of the infrastructure, the amazing aquatic centre, a completely redeveloped Alexander Stadium, improvements to a lot of our transport has been accelerated with the Sprint and Perry Bar and various other things. But also, I guess, the real legacy being what people felt about this, both locally and nationally. And I think, if you remember, and people probably forget this, in the run-up to the Olympics, there was huge skepticism, particularly in London, about its importance. And we probably all remember Super Saturday was probably the moment when it sort of flicked a switch, and we can't necessarily plan for that, but what we should plan for is how people are going to feel. And I think if they feel better about the place, that will probably be the most important legacy for all of us.
Brilliant. Well, I'm conscious of time. We've had one excellent question, I know, and nearly been keeping us highly entertained and fascinating. And thank you very much for sharing your insights. It's been a joy to chat with you, and I hope that everybody who's been listening in has enjoyed it as well. On that note, thank you very much, everybody, and have a good afternoon and a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Clive. Thank you.